John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. And today we're reading issue number 130, and just a little catch-up before we get into that. In the last issue, we saw John become embroiled in some sort of mob hit gone bad via his good friend Chaz. It seems Chaz was into a mobster for a lot of money from gambling, and he was offered a chance to pay all of his gambling debts off by just giving someone a ride, he was told. But it turns out that it was a driver for a hit job, and he ended up being part of this mob hit. I believe the name of the family that they hit was named the Coopers, and he was freaking out because these people are well known to be very dangerous and very unforgiving. And after this mob hit was complete, Chaz actually found himself in the car with the dead gunman, and he didn't know what to do, and he kind of parked the car and walked away, and the police saw him holding a gun and all bloody, so he did the best thing he could think of, which was go to John's house. And that is how John got embroiled in this whole situation. And it turns out that John actually knew these people, this mob family, the Coopers. And it turned out he had some history with them in the way of one of their children died, and the mob boss at the time demanded that John bring his son back from the dead. And that is where we left it. We didn't see if he actually did it or not, or if he did, if he was successful. And that's where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, we got the cover for issue 130. It's kind of in the same motif as the last cover, where there's a half a face that's very close up in the foreground, and behind us there's a whole other scene. So the face that's in front of us, instead of John like last time, this is the face of a boy who looks like potentially he's dead or undead, because his eyes are open and he's staring right at us, but his lips kind of look like they've been split open and there's some scarring, and also his face has a weird hue to it, almost like the blood is collecting in certain areas. And then in the background, we see two goons dragging John by his arms down a hallway. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Garth Ennis with art by John Higgins. And we turn to the first page and we see a very large and bloated man who's sitting in a big lazy boy sofa, and his stomach looks very distended and his skin seems to be falling off his face. He's drooling from the mouth. His hands are very bony and the skin looks like it's drooping off of them, and his fingernails have grown extremely long. And he's singing to himself, "Roll out the barrel, we'll have a barrel of fun." And there's two men standing in front of him, and one of them is looking in disbelief and says, "That's Harry Cooper." And the man behind him says, "Crying fucking shame." And we also see on this page that the name of the issue is Son of Man Part 2. Then the first man who spoke says, Well, what in God's name happened to him?" And the second man says, "He's not well." And the first man turns to the second and looks very annoyed and says, "It looks like he swallowed a fucking Zeppelin." And the second man doesn't look back at the first. He just stares at Harry Cooper on the couch and says, "He's not well, McNabb. He'll get better." And I believe this is supposed to be Inspector McNabb from the last issue, who was trying to find Chaz in John's apartment. And to the second man saying he'll get better, McNabb asks, "Says who?" And the second man answers, "We had this shrink have a look at him. Says he's got dementia. Says he's, what's his name, fixating on the fragments of his past." Then we cut back to Harry Cooper sitting in the chair, and he's saying, Let's get all around the old Joanna. Have a bit of knees up." And McNabb looks annoyed again and says, "That's not Harry's past. That's Dick Van fucking Dyke. What he's doing, mate, is talking a load of mental bollocks. Come on, Norman. You're his brother, for God's sake. You know what I'm talking about." And Norman replies, "He's not mental. He'll get better. Until he does, you take orders from me." And then McNabb lights a cigarette, and Norman kind of walks away from him. And as McNabb takes a drag of that cigarette, he says, "Really?" And Norman replies, "Yeah, really. So, any joy yet? You found out who had a go at me?" And McNabb answers, "'Fraid not, no. No driver, no hitman. No car, no gun. So far, Only my lot know what happened. Bit difficult for the four of us to search all of fucking London. Know what I mean? And then Norman answers sarcastically, I thought you was meant to be a copper. And then Norman turns to him and says, I am a fucking copper, but I can't exactly call on the vast resources of the Met when I'm trying to keep him from fucking finding out about it, can I? Because if my governor finds out I'm working for the Coopers, he'll have my bollocks for golf balls. Fuck. He'll sit me down on the tee and stick a 9-iron up me arse. And Norman says, Right, well, never mind the ones in the car. It's who sent 'em is what I want to know. And McNabb asks, You going to war over this then? And Norman answers, Fucking right we are. Cunts nearly killed me last night. McNabb asks, Bit messy, isn't it? And Norman gives a sneer and says, Tough shit. Get out there and start asking around. Find whatever bunch of slags ordered a hit on me. And in the next part of this sentence, he uses a bunch of racial slurs, which I will not say, but I will say the ethnicities instead of those slurs. So Norman names the people who he thinks might have had a hand in his assassination attempt, saying Chinese, blacks, Italians, Russians, even the fucking Irish. I don't give a shit. You find them so we can demolish them. Take Gestapo with you. And at this, McNabb throws up protests saying, Oh, not him. But Norman turns his back on McNabb and says, Look, you're old Bill, so you know who to talk to and how to find him. Gestapo's a nutter, so he gets results. Sooner you know the score, sooner we'll have this sorted. And McNabb picks up on something that Norman said, and he asks, We? And Norman turns like he doesn't understand, and he asks, Eh? And McNabb answers, You keep saying we, Norman. You mean you and Harry, or you mean someone else? And then he gets a big grin on his face, and he says, I was just thinking, Harry's boy must be grown up by now, mustn't he? Young Ronnie. The way I see it, he's taken a real interest in the business these days. Might even be him that's got everyone stirred up. Must make his old dad proud. And Norman gets a little defensive at this and says, I wouldn't pursue that line of inquiry, Detective Inspector. Not if I was you. And then McNabb makes a fist with his hand that has a cigarette in it, and he walks away saying, Whatever you say, Norman. You're the one giving orders. And then as he walks out, we see Harry is sitting in his chair and he's singing, Are we downhearted? No. Have a banana. So he's definitely just talking gibberish now. Then we turn the page and we cut to John and Chaz on a train. And John is speaking to Chaz saying, It was June of '82. The Falklands War was still on. And I was still off me fucking rocker. I was in and out of the bin like a ping pong ball in them days. Couldn't get Newcastle out of me head. Couldn't face reality at all. No, I was nice and cozy in me little padded cell. Then we get a flashback of John in Ravenscar, and he's being dragged by two attendants by the arms, and he's facing backwards, so they're kind of dragging his heels on the ground. And John is yelling, What are you fucking doing? Where are we fucking going? And there's a doctor with a clipboard walking in front of them, and he says, You're cured, Mr. Constantine. And John yells, I fucking am not. I'm still mental. I'm telling you. I'm mad as a fucking snake. But everybody continues walking, and without turning around, the doctor says, Nonsense, Mr. Constantine. You're as sane as I am. In fact, you're being released. And John yells, What? Then we turn the page and we see the doors of Ravencroft Asylum are closing on John and locking him off the premises. And as John tries to squeeze back in, he says, For fuck's sake, please, let me back in. I'm sick. I'm really fucking sick. And then the doctor says, You're cured, Constantine. Now fuck off. And then the door slams and John is left pounding on it, yelling, You can't do this to me. I'm still mental. I'm still mental. But then as he's pounding, all of a sudden he stops because he feels a presence behind him. And as he turns around, he sees three men, one small man in the middle and two bigger kind of goonish looking guys on the sides of him. And the man in the middle says, I hope not, Sunshine. You're going to need to be very sane indeed. Then we cut out of that flashback and back onto the train, and John is kind of smiling to himself and saying, Norman Cooper, on behalf of Harry. And then Chaz asks, What, they got you out? And John answers, Harry Cooper could get you out of hell if he knew whose legs to break, Chaz. Then we cut back into the flashback where John is now riding in a car with Norman Cooper off of the asylum grounds. And Norman asks, "You've heard of us then?" And then we cut inside the car, and John looks like he has new clothes, so they must have had those clothes in there for him. And he's pulling out some cigarettes, and he says, "Heard of Harry?" And Norman says, "Good. He wants you to do something for him." And John looks very surprised and says, "What? Shit. Why?" And Norman answers, "Because he's absolutely livid. He's just had the thing he cares most about in the whole fucking world taken away from him. He won't ever get it back. It's impossible. But Harry Cooper livid is bad fucking news. Know what I mean? In fact, for his family and his business and most of South London, come to that, it's a Force 10 fucking nightmare. That's why I told him I'd heard of this bloke who can do the impossible. So, for everybody's sake, Constantine, you'd better." And as he says this last line, he turns to John and kind of squints, and John looks very worried. Then we turn the page and we cut to inside of Harry Cooper's house, and he's saying to John, "My boy's sick. You're gonna cure him." And John looks very nervous as Harry says this because he's staring at a table with a dead child on it. And John turns to Harry and says, "But he's dead." And before John can really finish the sentence, Harry backhands him and sends John flying to the floor. And as John tries to get up, we can see his face is all bloody because his nose is bleeding. And Harry says again, "He's sick." Then we cut back to the train for one panel where John says to Chaz, "I found out later he'd been hit by a car. Just wandered out onto the street. Complete accident. God knows what Harry did with the driver." Then we cut back to the flashback where John is cowering in front of Harry and he says, "Look, I know what you want here, right? I know what you think I can do, what you want me to do, but I can't. No one can." Then we cut back to John on the train talking to Chaz and he says, "True, of course. Totally bloody impossible. You can do all sorts of tricks with them. You can talk to them. You can even call up ghosts. I even knew a bloke who could make corpses jump up and dance. But you cannot ever raise the dead." And then John looks down and says, "Harry didn't agree." Then we turn the page and we cut back to the flashback where Harry is choking John and he's screaming at him saying, "You fucking little bastard! You bring back my boy!" And Norman rushes forward and says, "Harry, no! No! For God's sake, stop it, Harry!" But Harry continues to choke John, and it looks like John might be passed out because his tongue is hanging out of his mouth, and Harry yells to Norman, "Fuck off!" And Norman continues to try to plead, saying, "He's no use if he's dead, Harry. The phone call, remember? The phone call!" And at that, Harry drops John to the ground, releasing his throat. And as John rubs his throat in tears on the ground, they pick him up and they put the phone receiver to his head, and we hear someone say, "They call me Gestapo." And John doesn't quite understand, and he asks, "Hey?" And Gestapo continues, "I'm in Liverpool today. I'm in a phone box at the end of a little terraced street. I can see in the window of the end house. There's a little girl, and she's playing. She's got Lego, and her mom's just brought her some lemonade. Dad left earlier. Gone to look for work. Do you know their names? Mom and the little girl? I do. It's Gemma and Cheryl." And John yells out, "No!" Then we cut back to the train, and John says to Chaz, "So then he told me what he was going to do to me sister and her kid if I didn't do what Harry wanted. And that was that." Then we cut back to the flashback where John is saying to Harry, "I'll need a couple of days." And Harry just looks down at him with a very stern face and doesn't say anything, and John just stares up at him. Then we cut back to the train where it finally pulls into a train station, and John and Chaz get off, and as they do, Chaz says, "But you said it was impossible." And John says, "Well, what frickin' choice did I have? I was just out of the nut house, and he had me over a barrel. I didn't know what else to say." And I guess they were getting off one train to transfer to another, and as John looks around at the people boarding that train that they're going on, he says, "Christ, I'm not getting on the tube with this lot. Go and fetch your cab while I have me breakfast, will you?" And Chaz tries to argue, saying, "Oh, John, I'm fucking knackered. I don't want to go halfway across town in the middle of the bleeding rush hour." But John snaps back at him, "Yeah? Well, I didn't want to go to Southend last night to dump a fucking body in a duck pond. Just do it, all right? And as Chaz walks away to do that, John lights a cigarette. Then we turn the page, and we cut into Chaz's cab because he has gone to get it, and he's picked up John. And he asks John, "So, what'd you do?" And John answers, "What I always do. Found a few of me mates, told them some lies, and roped them into something just short of suicide. Brendan was first." Then we cut to John walking into a pub, and we see Brendan, his friend, lying on the floor, and this is a flashback to the past, of course. And as John walks in and sees Brendan on the ground, he says, "Who the fuck would let you run a pub?" And Brendan looks up and sees John standing there, and he says, "I'm only minding it for Thick Davy, John. He's on his holidays. It's been a veritable triumph, but I'm telling you, by simply doing away with outmoded concepts like licensing laws and paying for drink, I've created heaven on earth." And John looks around the pub and sees other people who are really drunk smiling up at him, and there are two men passed out near John, and he says sarcastically, "So I see." And then as Brendan gets up, John says, "Got something tasty you might want in on, mate. Hop in the bath, and we'll go and see Rick, all right?" And Brendan stands up and finishes his drink, and he says, "Why? Has it wheels on it?" Then we turn the page, and we cut to a church, and from the outside we hear people singing, "Satan, I'm worshiping Satan, 'cause Satan has the things that I adore. Satan, I'm worshiping Satan, 'cause Satan keeps me stocked with drugs and whores." Then we cut to the inside, and we see a congregation that looks very different from what you would expect to find in a church. There's like half normal people who are wearing like church Sunday clothes. Then there's people wearing goat's heads and people dressed in basically lingerie. And the second group of people were those who were singing. And there's an old woman from the first group of people who are wearing church clothes. And she looks up at the pastor or priest who we have seen in Garth Ennis's run as John's friend Rick the Vicar. And the old woman says to him, "How are we supposed to worship alongside these perverts, these practitioners of the black arts? This is blasphemy." And then Rick smiles at her from his pulpit and he says, "Miss Potter, that's what the Church of the Blessed Reconciliation is all about. How can we expect our dear Lord God to welcome his fallen angel back into the fold, to love the unlovable, if we ourselves turn our satanic brethren away from our door? Please, Miss Potter, in the name of universal peace, share your hymn book with Lord Gorgomoth Scumflagon." And we can assume that Lord Gorgomoth Scumflagon is the man wearing the long robes and goat skull on top of his head that is sitting next to her. Then we see John and Brendan come into the church and sit in the back pews, and Brendan asks John, "What in the name of Jesus is he doing this for?" And John kind of smiles and says, "Bet with the Pope." Then we turn the page, and we cut to Brendan, Rick, and John sitting at a table. And I think this is supposed to be Rick's house, and all three of them are drinking tea. And it seems John has been explaining to them some plan, and he's finishing that explanation saying, "So all we need's Header, and then we can get started." And Rick asks, "Header?" And John says, "Yeah, what about him?" And Rick looks a little bit worried as he says, "John, haven't you been reading the papers?" Then we cut to a nighttime firefight, and it looks like some sort of war is going on, and there's people yelling, "Shit! Fuck! Ah! No time for prisoners! Keep going!" Then we get closer to the soldiers fighting, and one of them says, "You heard this, Sergeant!" Then we see a young Header, who, if you remember from the Garth Ennis run, is John's biker friend who is Scottish. And I say that's because he is written with a very hard accent, so I'm going to read it as is, and I'm going to do my best to do that accent, as it is written. So another member of the platoon yells to Header, "Header, on your left!" And then Header stabs at someone with his bayonet, and then he yells out, "Shit!" And of course, bullets are flying by and mortars are going off, and it's very chaotic. And then we turn the page and we see Header and some of his platoon mates are hiding behind a rock trying to take cover. And a radio man comes up to Header and says, "You're wanted, mate." And then he hands the radio to Header, who says, "Jesus, watch your fucking hide, pal." And then as the radio man takes cover next to him against the rock, he says, "Some prick came on asking for you. Fuck knows why. Sounds like an officer." And that seems kind of confusing to Header because he says, "Wait, what the fuck would get on the platoon net, And then he hears a voice on the line and he says, "Constantine." Then we cut to John in England at a payphone, and he's saying, "Surprised? Reverse the charges, mate. So listen, I need a bit of a hand here. Yeah, I know there's a war on. I can hear it. Don't worry, I'll have you back in time to finish it. See you soon." And then we cut to Header, who is putting the phone down, and we see the radio guy is shot in the head and he's dead. And Header just has a stunned look on his face, like he can't believe that John was able to get through to him. And he says, "Is there nae escape?" I guess referring to that he can't get away from John no matter where he goes in the world. Then we turn the page and we cut to John, Header, Brendan, and Rick. And Rick is asking Header, "How is the South Atlantic this time of year?" And Header replies, "Piss off. Let's just get on with it, right? How the fuck are ye gonna bring a dead kid back to life?" And John takes a sip of lager and says, "Can't. I thought we could call something up to fill in for him, if you know what I mean." Then we cut to John in the back of Chaz's cab where he's telling the story, and he says to Chaz, "See, the state I was in, all I wanted was to sort Harry's boy out, and then never go near the Coopers again. Just run and hide and forget all about it. But there was no way the lads would go for that. Save Cheryl and Gemma, fine. But leave some bastard thing from hell in the middle of the fucking Cooper family? No chance. That's why I had to lie my arse off." Then we cut back to the flashback where John is speaking to his three friends again, and he's finishing telling his plan to all of them, and he's saying, "And Harry gets his boy back. Okay, possessed by a demon. But we'll be running the fucker, won't we? Our own little agent inside the biggest operators in organized crime." And then Header says, "Aye, but how do we stop the bastard committing all kinds of fucking atrocities?" And John answers, "Control sigil. Cut one into its soul." And then Rick looks kind of worried at that, and he says, "You can do that?" And John looks at him and smiles and says, "Can't you?" And if you remember, that is what John did to Ellie to hide her from the first of the fallen. So either this is before that or it's after it, but he knows he can do it at this time. Or he might even be bluffing because he's literally lying to them anyway. So you never know with John. Maybe he just heard about it and he's never actually done it before. Then we turn the page and we cut back to John in the cab, and he says to Chaz, "They were real players, all three of them, all in their different ways. They saw a chance at something massive, and that addict's light came on in their eyes, that lust to play the game. Just like me, really, but nowhere near as bad." And as he says that last line, we see he has a grin on his face, so he seems pretty pleased with himself that he's a bad boy. And then Chaz asks, "So how'd you do it?" And John answers, "Oh, well, the usual. Drew a funny big star on the floor, lit some candles, chanted a load of pig Latin. Brendan and Rick helped with the summoning. Header was there for something else. Anyway, you gotta remember, I wasn't at me best. Our first go was a bit of a disaster." Then we cut to the first go around, I guess, and we see a man with a guitar being summoned forth, and he's singing, "I am an anarchist, and I am an antichrist," which are the lyrics from a Sex Pistols song. Then we see John cover his face with his hand in embarrassment, and he says, "Oh, Jesus, we've got Sid." I assume he's talking about Sid Vicious. And then Brendan looks at John and says, "Very impressive, I must say." Then we see Sid smashing his bass guitar on the ground, and he's yelling, "Ah, why won't his fucking bass work?" And then John, who's got his back to Sid, says to him, "'Cause you don't know how to play it, Sid." And then he points with his thumb and says, "On your bike," which I guess means go away. Then we get a panel of John in the back of Chaz's car, and he says to Chaz, "We had better luck second time around. If you call it lucky, setting that fucking thing loose." Then we cut back to the past where the second time around is happening, and we see a lit up sigil on the ground, and a being is appearing in the center of it, and it's got a black cloak all around it, basically from his shoulders to the floor, and surrounding his whole head except its bottom jaw is some sort of black helmet or orb or something that is completely around its skull. And as it looks around at the people who called it forth, it asks, "Who calls?" Then we see Rick kind of smile at John and says, "That's a bit more like it." And I can't tell if John has excitement on his face or kind of trepidation, but he says, "Yeah." And then he purposefully reaches out his foot and scuffs the pentagram so that the seal is broken, which if you know anything about like sigils and stuff like that, if you break the seal, That means that the being that was trapped inside of it can now get out. And at this, the demon smiles very big, and we see he's got rotted teeth, and it's missing some of them, and it's drooling, and it says, "You broke the line. I am rendered physical. I can get you." But John doesn't seem intimidated. He's kind of smiling, and he says, "Spot on, mate. Of course, if you're rendered physical, we can get to you, too." And we see that Heather is standing behind John, and when John says this, John quickly steps aside, and Heather has a shotgun, and the demon looks at that and says, "What? Fuck." And then Heather fires both barrels into its chest, blowing its chest completely out the back. Then we see all four men jump on the being, and Rick is yelling, "Hold it down! Don't let go! Don't!" And Brendan yells, "Heather, smash the fucker's teeth out! Squash its bollocks!" And then Heather moves in to do that, and he's saying, "Hold still, ye ugly big shite! Jesus Christ!" And then we see John pull out some sort of knife or scalpel, and he says, "Here we go, lads." And then he lunges forward and begins carving into the demon's soul, which I never really thought about it, but I guess demons in Hellblazer's lore have souls. Then we cut back to Chaz's car in present day, and Chaz looks very shaken by what he's heard, and John is saying, "Once I cut that sigil, it was mine. When I called, it came running. Didn't matter where it tried to hide. I went straight down to the Coopers and had 'em lock me in a room with the boy. Called the demon, ordered it into the smashed, torn little body, and watched it crawl around, sealing up the holes and rips behind it. Then I gave Harry Cooper back his pride and joy." Then we cut to that moment where John is kind of pushing the boy towards Harry, and the boy looks up at his dad and says, "Daddy?" And Harry looks down with a big smile on his face and tears in his eyes. And then we cut to the back of Chaz's cab, and John is saying, "I legged it. I ran. Not that anyone noticed. So long as Harry had his son, he wasn't going to go barmy and start some sodden holocaust. And that was all they cared about. But I had to get out. I couldn't stand being near the Coopers a second longer. And I couldn't stand those little 5-year-old eyes boring into my back like fucking laser beams. I was the only one who knew the score, see? Not Harry or Norman. Not even Brendan or Heather or Rick the Vic." And it has started raining while John was telling this story, and the windows kind of fogged up from that, and we see John reach out with his finger and draw some sort of symbol on the window, and he says, "I know magic's double Dutch to you, mate, but this bit's horribly simple. The control sigil I cut into that thing's soul, well, a cut on a soul is just like any other. It scars over. It heals. And sooner or later, it's gone like it was never there." And as he says that last line, he wipes the window clean where the sigil was. And then Chaz looks very alarmed at this, and he turns around and says, "How long?" And John answers, 2 or 3 years at the most. And then Chaz says, "But that means," and John finishes his sentence saying, "It's been free to do as it likes for the last 12 years or so. Yeah, here we are." And then Chaz pulls over to a curb, and as John gets out, he says, "It's just about the stupidest, most fucking irresponsible thing I ever did, mate. I've been running away from it ever since, not daring to think what the fucker's been up to. And that, me old mucker, is what you've just landed us right smack in the middle of." And then he turns back to Chaz as he stands on the sidewalk, and he says, "Go home and wait by the phone, Chaz. Oh, and Chaz?" And Chaz, looking kind of sad, says, "Yeah?" And then John says, "Nice one," just to shove that dagger just a little bit deeper into Chaz's chest. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.